Hello, it's Amanda here from Suddenly Autistic, and in today's video, which is actually an audio with slides, I guess, is my reflections on social communication. As an autistic adult and somebody who's presented as neurotypical for most of their life and then found out that actually I was never neurotypical, I've always been neurodiverse, and particularly with my autism and my ADHD. I have had the pleasure and the trauma of seeing how that's accepted and responded to within society. Now that I'm gaining more insight into my autistic experience, I'm able to compare and contrast that with the experience I had as somebody who was in the world as presenting as neurotypical, or trying to present as neurotypical, or at least looking to neurotypical standards to explain themselves and to understand their behaviour and to work out whether it was my fault or deficit or just something else. So I ended up struggling to know where to start with this. So what I've done is I've constructed myself a piece of written work to go through with several pointers along the way to deconstruct what it means to communicate socially. What are the rules around that? Where do they come from? How do we know what they are? Who sets them? All of that kind of thing. And the reason I've done that is because that's how my brain processes work. I have been struggling to understand the origin of some of my problems. And also, as I've gone through my therapeutic journey, I have found that more often than not, when I'm talking to a particular therapist or watching on therapy content on YouTube or something like that, that while some of the content, the cause and effect, that this behaviour stems from this type of feedback or pattern, while some of that does make sense and resonate with me, much of it doesn't, and so as a consequence I'm often having to finish watching a therapy video or having a session with my therapist and then go back and reflect on it and reconstruct or evaluate that from my reality. Now, it's not that I think doing what I'm doing is bad. In fact, I think it's probably useful for everybody to do that. And I doubt whether there's a therapist in the world or a video on YouTube that perfectly sums anyone's experience up. But what I'm saying is that some of the patterns of, when you display this behaviour, it usually means that people want this, or they're trying to do this or achieve that. That type of deduction or pathway doesn't seem to resonate for me very often, which leaves me thinking, wow, I'm very strange compared to what they're saying. They must see a lot of people for whom this is the right path, whereas for me it's not. Why is it not the right path? What is the path that I'm on, and what is the difference there? And the reason I want to know that is because in knowing that, then I can communicate that to my therapist, and then we can explore that, and then maybe I can recover my trauma more quickly, more successfully, and also extend my capacity, because trying to make life a little bit easier for myself, or a bit more enjoyable, less stressful, all of the rest of it. So anyway, that's the context of what I'm doing. So I'll start reading through this now and see how it goes. So if humans really are social animals that thrive from social connection and acceptance, and I find social interaction complicated, draining, and counter-instinctual, am I still human? The first point that I reflected on here was that social networks and large societies are complicated and irrational, and the reason for that is because humans are complicated and irrational, and yes, that also includes me. So I am still human. If I find these things hard, there'll be a lot of other humans that find them hard also. From my suddenly autistic vantage point, I can look back at my life and point to hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of social interaction that felt slippery, confusing, and fraught with danger. Interactions that left me feeling hurt, rejected, marginalised, and worthless. But hurt feelings are something everyone experiences from time to time. However powerful and destabilising they may be, their transient and deeply personal nature make them entirely unsuitable for using to create rules. And also I take responsibility for my own feelings. It doesn't matter how harsh the world is and how much I'd like it to change or see me as it is, then, this is why I'm doing my work. I'm doing my work to understand myself better so that I can represent myself more fully and avoid being triggered into perhaps feelings and thoughts and behaviours that are not conducive to good mental health or good physical health for myself. So the second learning point I found in this journey was that society isn't built on feelings, which is something that I'm sure I already knew, but it's nice to clarify that. So if society wasn't built on feelings, what was it built around? Now, I found myself contemplating my birth family because that was the first sort of society that I knew, I guess, and one that I remain a part of. From here, I was left wondering where my drive to find logical, progressive patterns in social rules, norms and preferences came from. Because it turns out my DNA buddies are just as confusing and challenging as the rest of the world, and occasionally somewhat more so, given that I feel they should, be closer to my wavelength. Now, with that, in terms of trying to find logical, progressive patterns in social rules, that doesn't mean I think that's the best way to review social rules. That means that is my way of reviewing it. That is my pattern. That's the way that I'm approaching it. If you ask lots of other people to analyse this and, go down their own mental journey as to how society creates these norms and whatever, I'm sure that different people would have different ways, but that's my way to prioritise the thinking and look for patterns and things that can be learnt and applied across the board, I suppose, or at least within known context. And I assume that does sound particularly autistic, and well, that would make sense given that I am. So looking back, the rules that my family operated within seem to have been relatively unremarkable. We did do some things slightly different to others. We had our own set of priorities, our own set of best practices and punishments, but nothing that made going to other people's homes, into school or joining social activities particularly challenging for me, no more so than they would have been anyway. Otherwise, it wasn't because of the rules, basically. That said, it isn't to say that I didn't notice nuances and differences between our way and others, that I didn't prefer some of my friends' rules to ours, and vice versa, and that I didn't feel that some of the things that the collective we, as in my family, held to the highest esteem weren't quite as important for me as an individual, and therefore not taken up by me in my adult life. In all that, I could see that these differences were more subtle and somewhat less knowable and predictable than I would have liked or definitely wanted to see. So it's more confusing than I thought, to be honest. My family taught me that society does use behavioural norms to reduce chaos and create structure. Norms are a great way of setting shared expectations and goals, and some norms are formalised into laws. Most of them become rules, though, and in less critical cases, they might become just guidelines or preferences. Typically, within a family, it's the parents that set the rules, and they are based on what seems to be their beliefs, their values, their personal taste and preferences, and their aspirations. Now, learning number 3 for me was that there isn't just one set of rules, and not all rules need to be rooted in logic. So choosing to elevate something to a rule based on your beliefs is not necessarily logical, but it makes sense to you, and therefore it is logical, but outside of that context it probably isn't. And that sort of nuance is something that I wouldn't say I enjoy. I like looking for patterns, and I like discovering nuances as well as more obvious things, but it does make it more complicated. And whenever there's complication, there's challenges, and challenges, there can be misunderstandings, etc., etc. So reflecting on my childhood in this way brought some clarity to my deliberations, namely that complicated and irrational humans make complicated and irrational rules. And that sounds terrible. Or to simplify and be less judgmental, humans make rules. To be even more specific, it's powerful humans that make the rules, and they make them by reflecting on societal norms and then working out how important each one of those is to them and ranking them, and then adding a layer of other things, whatever they feel like basically within that. So the next thing that I highlighted was the idea that the norm refers to what's common or frequent, whereas normal is a word that we use that opposes abnormal. So we say something's normal when it's not abnormal. We say something fits the norm when it's the most common or frequent. Being autistic doesn't mean that I'm not human, but it does mean that I sit outside of the norm in as much as my way of processing information is uncommon or infrequently encountered within a population. That said, if data from autistic and other neurodiverse, diagnosed or otherwise, people is included with equal weighting when constructing society norms, we will exist within that data. Now, this again was a little bit of a revelation when I wrote that to myself, really, because I was under the impression that being autistic, I should be on an autistic spectrum and I should be viewing myself through that lens. But when I thought about it, I'm thinking, well, that may be true and that's good for the finer data and to see the patterns of autistic behaviour and know that these things are normal. But when I'm looking at myself in society, I am part of society. I vote, I go to the doctors, I went to school and to university, I go to, all of these things. I'm acting, I vote. Yeah, I said that already. I'm acting as a citizen and I'm counted in the data. Because that normalised data doesn't feel so close to me doesn't mean I'm not in that. That's what happens when you're a minority in a large data set. So learning number 4 was very much about that. It was being represented in the overall scheme of things, the normalcy data, and being understood and not one in the same. So just because I don't feel like the norm is me doesn't mean I'm not in there. My data is in there. One of the reasons I wasn't recognised as autistic as a child was because I didn't fit the criteria back then. And that's not so much that the criteria has got easier to pass and therefore less valid or more diluted. It's more because a lot has been learned and understood about the autistic experience in the last 10 or so years, especially when it comes to women. In a nutshell, the diagnostic tools have finally caught up with my reality. Oh, and when I say my reality, I mean how I present. And that's basically my behaviour. So the autistic criteria is now looking to more behaviours and including them, which is fine, but it doesn't mean it understands why those behaviours happen. Gaining a diagnosis has not changed the way that I take in information and feel the outside world, and neither has it fundamentally changed the way I process information. Instead, what it's done is added some insight, understanding and perspective to it all, allowing what was once hidden and tangled and buried to become clearer and more accessible by me. In turn, this has allowed me to access norms, standards and realities that are more suitable and applicable for me. That's the autistic spectrum norms. Understanding myself through the autistic lens has been pivotal in reducing the level of trauma I experience when interacting with others. Before diagnosis, I could only compare myself to a norm that negatively pathologised my preferences and the way that I present socially. This increased my personal distress, while at the same time excusing society for not accommodating or accepting me and my struggles. My struggles were actually viewed as my faults, which brings me to number 5. The norms underpinning societal values do evolve, but they do so slowly, and one would hope that as the autistic spectrum experience becomes more visible, it will be understood and valued rather than just counted, or discounted even. So noticing that I am actually in the data doesn't act as much comfort if just because I'm in there, I'm not really valued or seen. I've noticed as a species that we tend to make sense of data in relational terms. The data that shapes societal norms represents our behavioural traits, values, beliefs, tastes and aspirations. This in turn goes on to shape our laws, rules, guidelines, personal mantras and ultimately how we feel about ourselves. There's nothing neutral about this dataset. Indeed, it's loaded with emotion, desire, hope, fear, anger, frustration, ecstasy and excitement. Back in step 2, it was deduced that feelings are too fleeting, nuanced and unpredictable for them to be used to build a society, but it turns out that we just can't help ourselves. The data that gives us our norm doesn't hit society naked. Instead, it comes wrapped in a layer of judgment, informed by our feelings. And when I say our feelings, this is typically not all of us equally. Number 6 learning was humans rank behaviour and use it to value people. Behaviour, or the way in which we conduct ourselves, is a curious thing. I would argue that all the best relationships stem from us knowing, accepting and celebrating each other inside and out. I prefer to form relationships this way and will use everything in my power to get to know people at a deep level. This may be a me thing, or it may be an autistic trait, I'm not sure. What I do know is that this is less common. The norm in terms of general society is to observe the behaviour of another and use that as a guide to their value. There is no doubt that this would be a more efficient route to working people out, but is it as accurate and is it fair? Learning number 7, or point number 7, is where I butcher the Latin, and this is esse quam videri. Esse quam videri. It appears that humans take behaviour and use it to construct a concept of a person's character and personality. So what the Latin means is to be rather than appear to be. And to be is what we might class as character. And character is what we might be, or how we might show up when nobody's watching. So your private self, or your essence of yourself, your patterns and preferences on a deep level when you don't feel judged. To seem to be would also fit with our personality, and that is what you are in public. The social roles that you might play, the games you might invoke in social interaction, and all of that sort of thing. Personality can and does change in relation to our experiences and expectations, changing perspective of the world around us. But character can also change and evolve, or devolve, but it does so at a much slower pace. According to the internet, or at least the research that I carried out, personality tests first came into being in 1919 when Woodworth designed one to screen recruits for the United States Army. Since then, they have grown into quite a movement, becoming everything from strategic profiling tools through to a bit of mindless entertainment. I've completed a few myself and have been somewhat interested in the patterns they highlighted. The scientific community largely agrees that personality tests are limited, though, in their capacity to truly be insightful, and instead favours a series of questions around character. And they use traits summarised by the acronym OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Learning number 8. All humans have two selves, the public and the personal, or the personality and the character. So on thinking about that, I'm thinking, so do I have two selves? And is having the two selves the same as masking? And if having two selves is the same as masking, then why do we only talk about masking as an autistic trait? It's likely that this two selves aspects of being human is natural and advantageous for us as social beings. It reminds us to pause, that our needs, impulses and desires should be double-checked and maybe even edited before they leave our private inner world and enter the public domain. Our privacy filter develops as we do, in line with our overall capacity. Typically developing toddlers, once happy to pee and poo proudly in public, shift to preferring to do their business in private, feeling proud when they can accomplish this autonomously. The public versus private realms of our life soon grow to involve not just our biological needs, but also our own preferences, before finally encompassing our thoughts and conceptual understanding of the world. It's quite typical and has been, especially with the political landscape of some countries being extremely volatile, to hold personal views and vote for candidates that you keep private and don't share or give away in public. And there's other things as well. We all have some aspects of ourselves that we perhaps don't want to share in public, but knowing what to share and when is something that I think a lot of people take for granted. But maybe that is actually quite a high skill that we should get to know how and why a little bit more, maybe. So, point 9: humans are born with different physical and mental capacity. The physical and mental capacity required to switch between our public and private selves changes throughout our lifetime, both increasing and decreasing in line with our overall physical and mental health and well-being. Changes can be temporary or permanent, progressive or regressive, linear or chaotic. And with that, it's a reflection on the fact that we don't just grow up once and have this set in stone. The way that we present and the control we have over that is definitely changeable. I'm thinking about times when maybe we're intoxicated with alcohol or other substances, and how that changes our ability to shift and control the switch between the public and the private. Then there's situations like with dementia, where often it's the private self or the filter that gets damaged first, and we start behaving in ways that are uninhibited, and doing things that are normal, or our old selves wouldn't have even attempted to do. So there's all sorts of things. Humans tend to find the behaviour of others most difficult and distasteful when it challenges our basic concept of what should be kept most personal. Few would agree that squatting on a busy pavement while out shopping is an appropriate time and a place to boo. And sorry about the metaphors all the time, or the stories. This is the only one I got. It's stuck in my head. Yet most of us can imagine a scenario when, rather than be repulsed or shun that person, we would rush in and help in a bid to minimise the risk, harm and embarrassment that person might encounter. Typically, in these scenarios that involve another person, we will help when we feel that they're physically or mentally disabled, and that's either permanently or temporarily. They might be disadvantaged or distracted, or have some trauma or something that puts them in a position where they can't control these reflexes as well as they otherwise might. In these situations, we can clearly see and track a cause and effect, and understand that it's not their bad character or their antisocial behaviour, and a conscious choice to go and do the thing that we find otherwise repulsive. Thinking along these lines provides an insight as to why the lived experience of those with low support need autism is often peppered with trauma. And no, it's not necessarily that we want to poo on the pavement to be accepted for that, because I'm sure most people wouldn't even think of doing that. But it's more that some of what we do does invoke in others a level of discomfort and disgust that would be justified if someone just did that for no other reason, that they felt like it. But not us. Sometimes we can't, like, there's softer things, everyday things that we're judged very, very harshly for, but actually it's not within our control to stop that. And the judgment is coming again from the behaviour rather than from the behaviour, which is your personality or whatever, rather than the essence of that person. They are misattributing the behaviour or misinterpreting it. So learning number 10, if it can't be seen, it can't be believed. This is more of a reflection. So I then think about insight, and insight is our capacity to gain an accurate and deep understanding of someone or something, the someone possibly even being ourselves. So it's likely our capacity to choose how and when to switch between the personal and public starts with our level of insight. Central to an autism diagnosis are struggles around insight, a fact that makes sense of how I could live for 46 years without realising that was my actual reality. A lack of personal insight manifests in a lack or reduction of power, and therefore of control over how and when the personas are switched. Suddenly, I'm feeling like I'm getting somewhere. A diagnostic criteria that includes struggles with or a lack of insight isn't the same as saying zero or no capacity for insight, although that could be one point on a spectrum of possibilities. A more likely scenario is that many of us with autism have the inherent capacity to gain insight into our behaviour, and that gaining insight could translate then to an increase in the level of power and control we can exert over it. And if that's true, then all that's missing from the equation is the motivation to act and make those changes. So 11, overcoming inertia. Inertia is a tendency to do nothing or remain unchanged. Autistic and societal inertia may display the same behaviour, i.e. nothing changes, but that doesn't mean that behaviour grows out of the same root cause. Autistic inertia comes from our tendency towards monotropic thought patterns. Monotropic minds tend to have narrow but deep focus and can get lost down rabbit holes, stuck on train tracks, or absorbed in minute detail. Monotropic minds struggle to toggle between tasks and have great difficulty reprioritising when resources and/or external stimuli changes. Monotropic thought is often called hyperfocus and is central to our motivation to develop very deep, special and all-consuming interests and special and hobbies. It's as if we become the hobby, or there's a lack of separation between the two things. Western society has been set up in a way that favours more generalised thinking patterns that utilise shortcuts, that prioritise broad and shallow over narrow and deep. And that's not to say narrow and deep aren't useful. They are, and these skills are often highly sought after in certain professional domains. But in general everyday life, not so much. While it's likely a person could switch between monotropic and generalised thought from time to time, if the dominant or even the exclusive program is monotropic, changes become very difficult indeed. And again, this is an insight for me because it's the autistic brain is typically heavily monotropic. So whereas the neurotypical brain is typically quite generalised, it's no doubt easier for a generalised thinking pattern to find some things that are particularly interesting for them and get into a deep thought set, possibly not so deep as an autistic monotropic mindset, but deep enough to pass what needs to be done. Whereas for an autistic person with a deeply monotropic mindset, coming out of that and entering into a more generalised thought pattern is often somewhat impossible, at least for anything of any substance. And who knows what's of substance to an autistic person? It could be anything that's of substance, to be honest. That's half the problem. But inertia in society is not just about that. It's not just about how people think or the mechanisms of thought processes. It's also about what people choose to think about. What people think about stems from what people value. And that's where I get onto the last thing, which is the value judgments, number 12. While societal norms are constructed from all the data of a social group, not all of that data translates equally or equitably into laws, rules, aspirations and guidelines. First, the data going in is only as good as the insight that accompanies it. Second, normalised data is always a generalisation that more closely reflects the middle zone than it does the edges. So like I was saying before, being autistic in a generalised society, our autistic experience sits outside of the norm. So while we are on the graph of distribution, we will have strengths and deficits that are probably at either end of the scale and only a few things in the middle. So laws made around the middle might feel quite alienating and difficult for us in a way that they're not for the average person or the average neurotypical person. The autistic experience is one of many variations that exists within a normal society, but being a minority, its nuances are often drowned out or normalised in a data set that's large and blunt, such as the whole society. Everything about how normalised society works pushes the autistic experience further to the margins. At worst, this disempowers and marginalises us by pathologising our differences. But at best, it allows us to capitalise from the differences, as long as we agree to only show up and speak up within that box. Like I said, you might be lauded at work and celebrated for your analytical skills, but go to the pub with your colleagues after work and start analysing their behaviour or talking in such a deep way, and they'll quickly turn around and have a conversation with somebody else, unless they happen to be valuing that kind of communication, which in my experience is less common. To summarise, with greater insight comes greater power, and being autistic comes with a lack of insight or an insight deficit that needs to be strategically, carefully and consciously worked on. And that's not to say neurotypicals have great insight. It's likely that the majority of neurotypical people have as little insight into why and how they do things as autistic people. But society is more aligned to them anyway, so the need to understand their behaviour is less pressing, or causes slightly less concern maybe, or the coping mechanisms they employ are more accepted as normal. With greater power comes a greater and a higher level of control, and with more control comes more peace, more comfort and more acceptance. And in this dynamic, I'm talking about power, control and insight of the individual. Now, it's nice and possible with great insight, power and control, that can be used to manipulate situations outside of ourselves. But that is not something that I'm thinking about here. That is something that sort of catalyzed, or was the catalyst for me to do this behaviour, because this essay, because I was watching a video on manipulation and thinking, wow, I don't really understand this. So I've had to go back a step to get there, but that's what I will cover next. From all of that, power, control and insight, we find ourselves better rested, and then we have better opportunities to reach our full potential. So finally, and to sum up, it's my hope that those of us with autism will eventually be seen for what we are rather than what society thinks we are. Achieving that will require a massive shift across the whole society, and that shift won't happen without a large injection of enthusiasm and will. For that barrier to be breached, we need the autistic experience to be seen, to be understood and valued as different, not less. And we can only do that if we work together and create safety and space and time for people showing up as autistic to learn and grow without criticism. Unfortunately, as I sort of reflect on this from my 48 nearly years of existence, so much damage is done when you go out and try to show up and put your best self forward and do good things in the world and get rejected. It takes a few seconds to trigger that level of trauma and rejection in somebody, but it takes many, many months and years sometimes to recognise that's what happened and then to resolve that. I understand that other people can't be responsible for your feelings and can't shield you necessarily, and that's not what most autistic people want, but I think it's become clear to me through looking at how society is constructed and how we have to cope that it's difficult. It is difficult, and some space. It's important that we are given some space and support in order to go on this journey for ourselves, so that we can start to add value. Because I don't believe the autistic experience is any different to the neurotypical experience of having struggles with addiction, maybe abuse growing up, rejection, sense of self, disappointment, depression, anything. I think everybody does have something, and I think that's where some of the feedback you always get as an autistic, high functioning or low support needs person, when you're questioning society and everyone, and someone says, well, everyone feels a bit of that sometimes. I think that's where that's coming from. And yes, most people do struggle in society at some point. Hardly anyone becomes as successful as they perhaps would want to be, or has things as easy as they'd want to be, or as many friends as they'd like, or as fewer arguments as they are having, or better marriages. But we're not all coming at it from the same place. So while I think that there's a lot to be learnt with and shared from the autistic experience, it's only one perspective, but it is getting a bit lost and washed out in the general scheme of things. And I think it's about time that we did put that where it belongs, take a closer look at it, and have us learn from each other, and then have the greater society learn from us. Thank you for listening.